Hello and welcome to Look North. Our top story tonight. An apology to 5 children abused in Bradford over 17 years. A report says the authorities failed to protect them. We hear from one young woman who was abused from the age of 13. She says it's still happening to other girls.
My eldest daughter got adopted because of the fact I was getting abused, and I've missed out on most of her life.
Also tonight, the very latest from Tokyo with more success for our athletes. She was on crutches 12 weeks ago. Today it's a silver medal for Leeds' Georgia Taylor-Brown in the triathlon. And Charlotte Fry from Scarborough and her horse Everdale dance their way to dressage bronze.
And there's a warning that today's thunderstorms will rumble on into this evening, still the potential for some torrential downpours. I'll be back later in the programme with all the details.
Good evening and thank you for joining us. Police, council and health bosses in Bradford have apologised to victims of child sexual exploitation in the area for failing to protect them from harm. An independent review of 5 cases since 2001 has found that children suffered abuse no child should have to experience. It was commissioned after 9 men were jailed for child sex abuse in 2019. In a moment, we'll hear first-hand from one of those victims. But first, Corinne Wheatley reports on the key findings of the review.
A report that makes for very distressing reading. Commissioned in 2019, the review looks at the cases of 5 victims of child sexual exploitation, 2 that began in the early 2000s and 3 that are more recent. The victims had been groomed from a young age and suffered sexual and physical abuse. The details are harrowing.
It clearly identifies that systems and processes did not keep these children safe in the way they deserved, and for that I would like to apologise.
The review says it was clear that agencies and individuals in Bradford do not always get it right. It said that despite improvements, some children remain unprotected, while some perpetrators remain unknown and unchallenged. And it found there are still lessons to be learned, and that the response to victims is not yet good enough in all cases. The review detailed how in the 2 less recent cases, the victims went missing regularly from their care home in the company of their abusers, and that the police response was poor.
I can give absolute assurance that the way that we would deal with and respond to reports of child sexual exploitation now are markedly different to the 2 older cases that are in the report. We've invested in specialist teams to investigate it, and we've invested heavily in the partnership around working with other agencies so that we can fully understand the risk that a child might be at.
Some victims and their solicitor have told Look North that the review published today does not go far enough.
It's a start. It's a tiny snapshot of what's been happening in Bradford, but the overall picture won't come out until there is a proper full-scale investigation along the lines of the investigation that Alexis J did in Rotherham. Only then will we realise the scale and the type of networks that have been operating in Bradford.
Victims want a full inquiry, like in Rotherham. Is there going to be a full inquiry in Bradford?
It's not for the council to call for inquiries on that scale. I think this report has been very frank and open about the challenges we face in Bradford. It contains a number of recommendations, 20 plus, which we accept in their entirety, and we will extract the learning from those recommendations and make sure we apply that to how we deliver services in Bradford.
There are 20 recommendations made in the review. The person who commissioned it will now be responsible for monitoring how well the authorities respond to it.
Professionals in this field, be they police, health, social workers, they're busy people. We've published this report today. It's a difficult read. It's a lengthy read. Do we really think they'll all pick it up tomorrow and read it? Well, I think they need better support than that. So we'll be giving them packages that say, this is what we've learnt out of this. We're particularly keen that we get the voice of the children and young people who have been directly affected out to staff.
The report recognises the improvements that have already been made, but says there is still a lot of work to do. Corinne Wheatley, BBC Look North, Bradford.
Well, one of the women who's fought for answers from Bradford Council and West Yorkshire Police is Fiona Goddard. She was groomed and sexually abused by gangs of men from 2008 when she was living in a Bradford children's home. She's been speaking to Emma Glasby.
How old were you when you went into care?
I was 12, just turning 13, and I was about 13 when the abuse started happening.
It was outside the gates of a Bradford children's home that gangs of men would pick Fiona up, drive her across the city and sexually abuse her. Now 27, Fiona lives with the trauma of her past.
My mental health is severely impacted. I've lost everything I own multiple times because of having to move for safety reasons or to just be able to get away from the memories. My children have suffered because I haven't been able to give them the life I'd have wanted to give them. And obviously my eldest daughter got adopted because of the fact I was getting abused, and I've missed out on most of her life. It's very hard sometimes looking back at the loss, and nothing will ever give me that back.
Fiona was often missing from the children's home. She sometimes came back bruised or even saying she had been sexually abused, but the abuse continued.
There was so many missed opportunities to save me from years of abuse, and they never did. If I saw someone that was repeatedly showing up, beaten up or making admissions of sexual abuse, I would want to help that person more. I would want to look into it, and I'm not a professional around that, so I don't understand how professional services couldn't want to do the same.
When you see in black and white that you were failed by all the people that were supposed to protect you, how do you feel reading that?
It feels a bit more like closure, like it's the final page to turn and then it closes the book. I've always been told they didn't fail me or they did what they could. Now an independent person has reviewed all of my files and agreed with what I've said, and it just feels like my fight is finally over now.
But Fiona is also adding her voice to calls for a wider investigation.
I think there needs to be an independent inquiry into at least a 20-year period in Bradford.
How widespread do you think child sexual exploitation has been in Bradford?
It's been happening for years, long before it started happening to me and long after it started happening to me. It's been hidden away.
Do you think it's still happening in Bradford?
Most definitely. Every time I see something on Facebook from West Yorkshire Police where a 14-year-old girl's gone missing and they're trying to find her, the first thought I have is, I wonder if the same's happening to them.
For now, Fiona is focusing on her mental health. She has post-traumatic stress disorder, but is still on a waiting list for treatment and openly admits she is struggling.
It's hard to move on with your life independently away from being that victim, and it's hard to change from being that victim to a survivor. I think it's a personal battle that I need to face, and eventually I think I will be able to move on.
And thank you to Fiona for sharing her story. Well, BBC Look North has been reporting on child sexual abuse in Bradford for several years. Victims have contacted us wanting their experiences to be heard and the failings highlighted. Our social affairs correspondent Emma Glasby explains how the story has unfolded.
It was 7 years ago a young woman contacted Look North. She'd been abused for years by gangs of men whilst living in a children's home in Bradford. The day after our report, a police investigation began. By 2019, the offenders were on trial. 9 men were found guilty of sex offences and jailed. The woman who stood up in court to face her abusers was Fiona Goddard. She waived her anonymity, telling other victims there is nothing to be ashamed of. Within weeks, another woman contacted Look North. Known as Alice, she revealed she'd been abused whilst in care in Bradford from 2001. Her care records show she fell pregnant at 15 and had an Islamic marriage. She told Look North the man she married had been grooming and abusing her. A week after that report, Bradford Council announced there would be a review looking at child sexual exploitation in the city.
Nazir Afzal is the former Chief Prosecutor for the North West and an expert in child sexual exploitation who previously called for an independent inquiry in Bradford. I asked him what he'd learned from today's findings.
It tells us, unfortunately, everything we knew 3 years ago, namely that the issue of child sexual abuse and child sexual exploitation in particular is a live one in Bradford and West Yorkshire, that perpetrators have been able to act with impunity, and that despite what we are told, lessons haven't been learned, even though that's always what we say at the end of a review.
Yeah, we heard Fiona's story tonight. She was living in a children's care home at the time. No one took action when children were coming home badly bruised, clearly distressed. The report highlights heavy workloads and high staff turnover, but it's no consolation to the people still living with these consequences today, is it?
We are their families, particularly if they're in care or in foster care. So, you know, I begin to question people's commitment. And by that, I mean those who lead the response. Because if they really did believe that these children need the same protection as their own, they would make it happen.
The victims, some of the victims are now calling for a public inquiry. Is this what's needed?
I would rather we get on with fixing the problem. And that means dealing with the professionals' inability to recognise and respond to abuse. And we've got to, at the end of the day, Amanda, make sure the perpetrators realise that there is no safe place for them.
And you've spoken before in the past that men from British Pakistani heritage have been responsible for the abuse of mainly white working class girls. Are the authorities facing up to these difficult questions about the perpetrators, as you mentioned?
More so than previously. I mean, we've had the Home Office report earlier on this year. Disproportionately British Asians, British Pakistanis are perpetrators of street grooming of the type that we are dealing with today. I don't buy into the conspiracy, there's some kinds of conspiracy to stop them being prosecuted. I think it's just incompetence. I think people just need to do their job better. And by the way, 99.99% of British Asians and British Pakistanis detest these men with a vengeance. And you are doing us no favours by not bringing these people to justice. We have a massive problem, not just around the supposed ethnicity of the perpetrators, but the fact that victims and children in particular just aren't safe. You know, we really have to get real here and start dealing with the problem and not just pretend that it will go away of itself.
Thank you so much for your time this afternoon, Nazir Afzal. OK, you're watching Tuesday's Look North. Still to come on tonight's programme.